You ever have one of those moments where the people in power think they can control every single detail of your life? Well, my HOA decided to fine me for fishing. Yeah, fishing. But instead of backing down, I did something they never saw coming. I bought the whole lake, then turned the tables on them. Today, I'll tell you exactly how it all went down. It all started on what should have been a simple, peaceful afternoon. I had grabbed my fishing rod, packed a small cooler, and walked down to the neighborhood lake, a place I thought belonged to everyone who lived there. For me, fishing was never about pulling in a huge catch or bragging about the size of the fish. It was about quiet. It was about those moments where the world slows down and you get to enjoy nature without the noise of everyday life. I had been fishing for years, long before this HOA decided to step in and start controlling everything from the color of mailboxes to the length of the grass in your yard. So when I walked down to the water, set up my chair, and cast out my line, I never thought for a second I was breaking any rule, let alone inviting trouble. But then I heard the familiar crunch of shoes on gravel, and there they were, two HOA board members, arms crossed, clipboards in hand, acting like they had just caught me committing some sort of crime. They didn't even greet me, didn't even ask how I was doing. One of them cleared her throat and said in the kind of voice only entitled people use, "You're not allowed to fish here without HOA permission." I laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke. After all, the lake was right in the center of the community. Families walked around it every evening, kids skipped stones on its surface, and I'd seen plenty of people throw in a line here and there without anyone saying a word. But these two weren't laughing. They looked at me like I had just broken into their private pool. I asked them to show me the rule, thinking maybe I had missed something in the massive stack of HOA guidelines they love to send out. That's when one of them pulled out a printed sheet, highlighted in neon yellow, and pointed at a single line buried in the fine print. Fishing in the lake is prohibited unless otherwise authorized by the HOA. They acted like they had just caught me red-handed. I remember shaking my head, thinking about how absurd it was that they cared this much about one guy sitting quietly with the fishing rod. But to them, it wasn't about fishing. It was about control. They needed to flex their authority, to remind everyone that they made the rules and everyone else had to fall in line. The next morning, I opened my mailbox and found the envelope, white, official, with Homeowners Association stamped at the top. Inside was the fine, not a warning, not a reminder, but an actual fine demanding payment. The number wasn't huge, but that wasn't the point. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to think twice before I ever did something unauthorized again. What shocked me the most wasn't even the fine itself, but the fact that they had documented the incident like I was some kind of repeat offender. Fishing violation, first offense, it read, as if I were on probation. I sat there holding that piece of paper, and I couldn't help but laugh. This was what the HOA had come to, policing fishing rods and punishing people for enjoying the lake that our dues pay to maintain. I thought about all the other things they ignored: broken sidewalks, overgrown bushes near the playground, trash bins left out for days. And yet, here they were, spending their time writing me up for fishing. It was so ridiculous, it almost didn't feel real. But at the same time, it lit something inside me. A fine like that wasn't just about money, it was about respect, or rather, their attempt to take it away. I started to think back on all the little frustrations that had piled up with this HOA over the years. The letters about lawn height, the warning for leaving my trash can out an hour past pickup, the time they threatened my neighbor with legal action over having the wrong shade of curtains in her front window. And now this. Fishing. They had crossed a line, not because the fine hurt my wallet, but because it proved they would never stop. If they could fine me for sitting quietly at the lake with a fishing pole, then there was no telling what they'd try to control next. That fine became more than a piece of paper. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the HOA. It was proof of how small people in small positions of power can make life miserable for everyone else when they start believing they own you. It wasn't just me against a rule. It was me against a system designed to squeeze compliance out of people no matter how absurd the demand. And in that moment, as I looked at the fine again and thought about the lake shimmering under the afternoon sun, I realized something had to change. When I first held that fine in my hands, my initial instinct was to just crumple it up, toss it in the trash, and move on. That's what most people in the neighborhood did whenever the HOA came after them for something petty. Pay the fine, grumble about it behind closed doors, and try to avoid making waves. That's exactly how the HOA thrived, because most people weren't willing to fight back. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't do what everyone else had done. This wasn't just about me and a fishing rod. This was about the principle of being told that something as harmless and peaceful as fishing was somehow wrong because a group of people with clipboards said so. I wasn't about to let that slide. The fine wasn't much money in the grand scheme of things. It wasn't going to break me, and that's probably what the HOA counted on. They knew people would just pay and move on because it was easier than dragging out a conflict. But that's exactly why I refused. If I gave in now, what was next? Would they decide that sitting on the lake bench for too long counted as loitering? Would they send out letters about the kind of shoes people could wear when they walked around the neighborhood? The absurdity of it all kept playing in my head, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt this heavy determination building inside me. I started by going over the HOA handbook. I pulled out that massive binder of rules they'd given us when we first moved in and flipped through page after page. Most of it was the usual nonsense about exterior paint colors, fence heights, and what you could or couldn't park in your driveway. But buried in the lake section was that tiny line they had highlighted for me: fishing prohibited unless otherwise authorized. It was vague, intentionally vague, like they had left it that way on purpose so they could interpret it however they pleased. And that was the part that infuriated me most. They didn't even need a solid reason. All they needed was an excuse. I thought about appealing the fine, maybe showing up at the next HOA meeting and making my case. But then I remembered how those meetings usually went. A handful of people sitting around a table, acting like they were running a small government, shutting down anyone who dared to challenge them. They weren't going to listen to reason. They weren't going to suddenly wake up and admit they'd overstepped. No, if I went in there, they'd probably double down just to prove a point. And the truth is, I was done trying to play by their rules. The decision not to pay wasn't made out of anger in the moment. It came after thinking long and hard about what it meant to constantly give in. I realized that every time someone folded, the HOA grew stronger. Every time someone stayed quiet, they got bolder. And if nobody ever stood up, they'd just keep reaching further into our lives until they controlled everything. I wasn't about to be another name on their list of compliant homeowners. I was ready to push back. But pushing back didn't mean yelling or throwing a tantrum. That's what they expected. They wanted me to show up at a meeting angry so they could label me as unreasonable and dismiss whatever I had to say. Instead, I chose a different path. I started thinking about how I could turn this entire situation on its head, how I could make a statement so loud that they'd never forget it. A fine for fishing was meant to humiliate me, to remind me who was in charge. But what if I found a way to remind them that they weren't as powerful as they thought? What if I made it clear that I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to outsmart them? The more I sat with that idea, the more it consumed me. I began to look at the lake differently, not just as a place to fish or relax, but as the symbol of their authority. They used the lake as leverage. They controlled who could or couldn't enjoy it, and they thought that power made them untouchable. But what if the balance shifted? What if I could somehow take away that one thing they used to control me? What if the lake wasn't theirs to regulate anymore? I didn't know exactly how I was going to pull it off at first, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to hand them my money. Not for this, not for something as ridiculous as fishing. That fine became my line in the sand, the point where I decided enough was enough. They wanted obedience, but what they got instead was resistance. And as that thought settled deeper and deeper into my mind, I realized I was about to do something that would change everything about the way this HOA operated. Is this conversation helpful so far? Once I had made up my mind that I wasn't going to bow to the HOA's ridiculous fine, the next question became, what was I going to do about it? I didn't want to just ignore them and pretend like nothing happened, because then they'd still think they had the upper hand. I wanted to make a statement, something bold enough that they would have no choice but to take notice. That's when the idea first hit me. If they wanted to control the lake so badly, what would happen if the lake didn't belong to them anymore? At first, it sounded crazy, even to me. Who in their right mind buys a lake just to prove a point? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If they used the lake as their power play, then I needed to take the lake away from them. I started researching immediately, late nights on the computer, digging through county property records, zoning maps, and land ownership documents. I wanted to know exactly who the lake belonged to, because one thing I'd learned over the years was that HOAs love to act like they own things that technically aren't theirs. Sure enough, when I pulled up the official records, I found that the HOA didn't actually own the lake outright. It was